you've seen the shape of things to come. In this presentation, I will be discussing the shape of things that are, namely the importance of understanding geometry and how it applies to EVE Online. We don't have a lot of time, only 50 minutes, so please hold all questions until the end, and let's jump right into it. The first concept we're going to cover is distance. Let's suppose that you're in a shuttle, and there's another shuttle 500 meters away from you in one direction, and a third shuttle, also 500... Oh, thank you. And a third shuttle, also 500 meters away from you in the opposite direction. Your overview reports they're 500 meters away. Their overviews say that you're 500 meters away from them. That part is simple. But their overviews also report that they are 1,028 meters from each other. 500 plus 500 is not 1,028. What's going on here is that all ships are surrounded by what I call a zero sphere, namely the sphere at which you are considered to be 0 meters away from that object. For shuttles, it has a radius of 14 meters. So the center-to-center separation is the radius of one ship plus the overview reported distance plus the radius of the other ship. Module ranges go according to the overview reported distance. So a 5-kilometer smart bomb, as used by a rock, covers a much larger volume when used by a Ragnarok. We'll be covering smart bombs again later. One thing that for some reason I can't figure out, my testing on Singularity indicates that the angular velocity column in the overview seems to use the overview reported distance rather than the center-to-center separation. There are cases where the distance and the center-to-center are dramatically different, and I don't know which basis is used for the angular velocity in turret calculations. So, for example, if you have a bunch of frigates swarming a bombless Titan, it's important to know if the frigates are out-tracking their own guns, despite being at least 8 kilometers away from the center of the Titan. Other types of objects also have zero spheres. Stations are notable in this regard, and in the case of stations, the zero sphere is also known as the docking perimeter. If you warp a fleet of ships to a station at 0 normally, then the game randomly arranges all of the fleet members onto a ball about 2.5 kilometers in radius and drops the center of that ball exactly on the zero sphere. However, according to my own testing, you need to be within 250 meters of the docking perimeter in order to dock at a station. So half your fleet is going to be able to dock immediately upon arrival. The other half of the fleet has to slow boat closer to the station before they can dock, assuming that they don't get bumped off by an interceptor that's waiting for them. It's worth noting that when you warped yourself to a station at 0, the game randomly arranges you on a ball about 2.5 kilometers in radius and drops the center of that ball exactly on the docking perimeter. Even odds that you're going to be able to dock at the station the moment you drop out of warp. However, if you have a bookmark, or more properly, a saved location, whether it's a saved personal location or saved corporate location, then you can warp your fleet to the bookmark, and that 2.5 kilometer radius ball that I just talked about, the center of that ball gets dropped exactly on the bookmark rather than on the edge of the docking perimeter. That way your entire fleet is guaranteed to be able to dock immediately upon arrival. There's no chance for them to be bumped off by anything before, or at least not by other ships, before they can dock. This isn't as much of a concern for stargates, since you only need to be within 2,500 meters of a stargate in order to jump, rather than 250 meters of a station in order to dock. So generally speaking, you're always within jumping range when you drop out of warp on a station, barring other circumstances like smart bombs or bubbles. By the way, don't place your, I call these cuddle bookmarks because they cuddle the station. Don't place them too close to the station because a ship dropping out of warp on a bookmark that's too close to the station will intersect the collision the collision surface, go bouncing off the station, and flying out past the docking perimeter. If the pilot happens to be distracted when this happens, they could be way outside the docking perimeter by the time they return their attention to the client. You don't want that to happen. There is one other aspect of station geometry that I want to talk about in this presentation, and that's the undock point. So for any given station type, there is always a point in space where ships undocking from the station always spawn in space, and they're given an initial velocity along some sort of undock vector, shown here in the green line. So ships spawn at the start of the green line, and they have a slightly randomized velocity, but in a cone around that green line. That's generally the direction that they go when they undock. In this diagram, all these ship brackets that you see are shuttles that were abandoned almost exactly on the docking perimeter of the station. So that's the docking perimeter for, in this case, a Caldari administrative station. As you can see, the spawn point is deep inside the docking perimeter, and it takes an undocking ship a long time to drift towards the docking perimeter. If you're trying to bump an undocking ship away from the docking perimeter, it's really hard to do it on this type of a station. So this is called a long undock station. A Minmatar trade post, on the other hand, is an example of a short undock station. The spawn point is very close to the docking perimeter. Undocking ships are only going to go a few kilometers at most before they cross the docking perimeter and are unable to dock up again. It's much easier to bump a ship off of the docking perimeter if it's just undocking from a short undock station than it is from a long undock station. So if you're going to play station games in PvP, you need to know the difference between a long and a short undock. That said, you only need to memorize the long and short undock stations by type rather than by every single station in the universe. All stations of the same type have the same geometry. All Minmatar trade posts are short undock. All Minmatar research stations are short undock. All Caldari administrative stations are long undock. You can also eyeball this. The zero sphere for any object follows three rules. First, it's spherical. Second, it's centered on the bracket for the object in question. In this example, right in the middle where it says Brooder Tribe Bureau. And third, the radius of the zero sphere is at least large enough to encompass the entire arc geometry. The zero sphere for acceleration gates is worth special mention because it's not obvious unless you understood the three rules that I mentioned before. Spherical, centered on the bracket, and large enough to encompass the entire arc geometry. Here, however, the bracket for the acceleration gate is on the back end of the gate, so that is where the sphere is centered. But the radius has to be large enough to encompass the front end of the acceleration gate. But because it's large enough to encompass the front end of the gate, it's also encompassing the space off to the sides, above, below, and behind the acceleration gate. Again, these ship brackets are shuttles that were abandoned on the zero sphere of the acceleration gate. So you can see that the zero sphere covers all this volume around the acceleration gate. If you want to align your ship for warp along the acceleration gate, but you don't know how long you're going to hold aligned before you actually activate, then you probably want to start off your alignment run behind the back end of the gate. In this example, the bottom end of the green arrow. Right. For most but not all dead spaces, including most but not all missions, the warp-in point for the dead space is centered on the bracket for the acceleration gate. And the acceleration gate has acceleration gate's zero spheres have a radius of about 12.7 kilometers. So you can warp to the mission to within 10 kilometers, and it will drop you out of warp still inside the zero sphere of the acceleration gate. And you're less likely to get caught up on the collision surface of the acceleration gate than if you had warped to it at zero. For my fellow incursion runners, the warp-in point for an override transfer array is, as you know, off to the right side of the gate. From there, it doesn't take very long while aligning to leave the zero sphere and then to leave 2,500 meters of the zero sphere and then no longer be able to activate the acceleration gate. So if you're sitting on an OTA and you're waiting for a replacement fleetmate to arrive, as long as you're doing nothing, you may as well slow boat back behind the back end of the acceleration gate so that you have more room to align. Earlier, I mentioned that stations have a collision surface. In a December 2010 dev blog, Drakes of Destiny, Part 1, Crowd Control Productions revealed that in the Destiny physics engine, all objects in space are represented as one or more balls for the purposes of calculating collision. Uh, if you're going to light a cynos field so that a jump freighter, dreadnought, carrier, or rorqual can dock immediately at a station, then you need to remember that the capital jumping in will appear about 5 kilometers off of the cynos field. So that entire 5-kilometer radius has to be within the docking perimeter of the station, but also entirely away from the collision surface of the station. By the way, this particular diagram with the collision surface I've drawn is essentially my own bad artist's rendition. I don't actually know the exact collision geometry for this station type, or any station type for that matter, just that it approximates the art geometry. But this gives you the general idea of what to expect. Also, this same issue with cynos fields applies to cynoing in jump freighters on stargates leading into high security space. You don't want the jump freighter bouncing off the gate. Geometry is also important to consider with smart bombs for 2 reasons. First, the smart bomb has a limited radius of effect. And second, smart bombs cannot be fired too close to a wormhole, station, stargate, or acceleration gate. The definition of too close varies by the situation. Under no circumstances can a wormhole, stargate, station, or acceleration gate get caught within the radius of effect of a smart bomb. Additionally, smart bombs cannot be fired within 6 kilometers of a wormhole or 5 kilometers of a station, acceleration gate, or stargate, even if the radius of effect of the smart bomb is smaller than that. Of course, all of the above also precludes smart bombs being fired on or underneath 0 on these objects. So if a smart bomb user wants to smack you near one of these kinds of objects, he or she has to decide on which side of the object they're going to smack you. So you need a Tech 2 battleship-sized smart bomb to graze the surface of a wormhole, or a Tech 1 battleship-sized smart bomb to graze the surface of a stargate, acceleration gate, or station. If you want to smack a Cov-Ops frigate that's trying to escape through a wormhole, it's not too difficult to completely surround the wormhole and smart bombing battleships. At least 6, you might need a few more. But if you want to smack a frigate trying to escape through Stargate Creel Air, you might need to cover it with a few more battleships because it's a slightly larger object than a wormhole. So usually you want to make some sort of assumption as to which direction the frigate is coming from, such as assuming that it's coming from Stargate Meroidum. This is how the Rancer pirates kill a lot of frigates. Hapless frigates warp from Stargate Meroidum to Stargate Creel Air at 0, and they're crossing right through the radius of effect of the smart bombs. They die. This is a good situation to have a recon, tactical, or far bounce bookmark. You can warp your frigate to the bookmark, and then warp from the bookmark to the gate, completely avoiding the radius of effect of the smart bomb. A Cov-Ops strategic cruiser, of course, can tank a full volley of smart bombs and shrug and keep going. So it depends on what you're flying. Smart bombing someone emerging from a wormhole is the same situation as trying to smart bomb somebody escaping through it, since emergence and activation distances are the same for wormholes. For stargates, however, anybody emerging from a stargate comes out 12 to 14 kilometers off the gate in a random direction. So you need a lot more smart bombs to cover that entire shell, so this is typically not done even for small-ish gates. For huge gates, smart bombing somebody emerging from it is out of the question. Next, grids. I'll try not to spend too much time here. Grid FUA Practical Manual contains a more complete treatment, but details might be out of date. I'll go over the basic concepts very quickly. A grid is a volume of space where the game believes that uncloaked objects should be able to see each other on overview. Cloaked objects can see everything else that is on the grid, but obviously cannot themselves be seen. If 2 ships are not on the same grid, then they cannot see each other on overview. Grids, however, have boundaries, and these boundaries can be crossed in either direction. The boundaries can be expanded, but not for a single object herring off by itself into the wild black yonder. To extend the grid, you would have to jettison containers or anchor objects or whatnot at regular intervals. or have two or more objects traveling together in the same direction. Then in these cases, the grid will be expanded. However, in this latter case, if it's a group of objects moving by itself, not leaving a trail, then the grid can undergo a strange form of mitosis, where the game believes that these two separate volumes are part of the same grid, but the volume in between is not. Do I need to make sure that this clicker is pointing that way? Do I need to make sure the clicker is pointing at you?
No. Just hold it in your hand. Don't place it on the podium.
Got it.
If you hold it in your hand, you're good. You don't have to point it.
All right, thank you. Grids have a default size on creation. It has been my personal observation that the grids around stargates are cubes aligned with the coordinate axes of the solar system, 700 kilometers on edge, and centered. Did you say something?
No.
Okay. And centered on the stargate. I don't think any grids are spherical, but I haven't extensively tested all grids, just the default grids around stargates. If you warp to the middle of nowhere, then the game will create a grid just for you, and it will have a default size. As mentioned previously, the grid can be expanded. However, two pre-existing grids cannot merge or overlap. So one grid can expand at the cost of contracting an adjacent grid. There is a limit to how far you can push this. I don't know exactly what that limit is, but this boundary, also called a grid wall, will not get pushed any further. You cannot contract the other grid any further. Grid walls have interesting effects on combat. The game assumes that if you are not on the same grid, then you are out of range of anything taking place on the other grid. So you can, for example, break a target lock and warp scramble by crossing a grid wall. Be forewarned, I do not know CCP's policy on using grid foo to break combat effects at ranges where they would normally operate. If you get banned for exploits, that is on your head. That being said, it's useful to understand the mechanics so that you know when grid foo is being pulled on you. One time I was out in null security on my Helios and moving away from the Stargate I had just emerged from. There were warp interdiction bubbles anchored on the gate. I could see those on overview. When I was about 120 kilometers out from the gate, the bubbles disappeared from overview, indicating that I had crossed a grid wall, something which should not have happened until about 350 to 600 kilometers out, depending on angle. Definitely not 120 kilometers. There were other players in local with me, so I deduced that there had to be players maintaining a separate grid near the Stargate. Next, warp interdiction bubbles. If you are inside a warp interdiction bubble, you cannot go to warp until the bubble shuts down. Oh, hello, I'm just rehearsing. Please, take a seat. You cannot go to warp until the bubble shuts down or you leave. Simple, not complicated. If you're trying to warp to a grid that has a bubble in it, then the game checks for any bubbles in or beyond your flight path on the destination grid and drops you out of warp on the nearest side of the nearest bubble. If you're returning to EVE Online from a long absence, then yes, this is a change. Bubbles no longer interfere with all warps within 85 kilometers of their center. They no longer ignore all warps beyond 85 kilometers of their center. Easier shown than said. So, this bubble will divert your warp. It's in your way and on the destination grid. This bubble will divert your warp. It's in your way and on the destination grid. This bubble will divert your warp. It's beyond your way and on the destination grid. This bubble will not divert your warp. It is not on the destination grid. It is worth noting that any ships on the Stargate side of the grid wall are not interdicted by this bubble. I'm just rehearsing. Please feel free to take a seat. Nope, you are not late. I'm just doing last-minute rehearsal. This bubble will not divert your warp. It is not on the destination grid. It is not on your starting grid. Forget about diverting your warp. This bubble is going to prevent you from going into warp. It's on your starting grid. You have to go around. This bubble will not divert your warp. It is not on the same line. If you have a bookmark and the bubble happens to be in line with the bookmark, then your warp is still going to get diverted. Having a bookmark doesn't help if the bubble is in line with the bookmark and the gate. Here, the bookmark is well placed because the bubble happens to dodge the bubble that's in the way. The bubble is not on either of these two lines. One time while flying in null security, and I emerged from a stargate, and an interdictor tried to drop a bubble in front of me to prevent me from going to warp to the next gate. Thankfully, I was on the edge of the bubble, so I just aligned to a moon in the opposite direction, went to warp to the moon, and then warped to my recon bookmark on the next gate. Yes, I know. There can be hostile starbases at moons. But the fastest starbase module takes 7 seconds to lock a COVOPS frigate. Right. So as long as you warp in and then immediately warp out, you'll be fine. It depends on what you're flying, though. If you're a big fat battleship, you're probably going to get smacked with a few pot shots. Gates can be surrounded in a cage of bubbles. A bubble cage, if you will. Remember that each bubble is spherical, but a collection of spheres is not itself a sphere. So a bubble cage will have nooks that you might be able to warp into to shorten the amount of sublight distance that you need to cover in order to get to the gate. Next up, dead spaces. A dead space is a volume where, 1, if you attempt to warp into the dead space from the outside, your warp gets redirected to the entry point of the dead space. And number 2, you cannot warp from one point to another in the same dead space. You cannot warp there because natural phenomena are disrupting the warp. Dead spaces are used all the time in missions and dead space complexes. I'm just rehearsing, come on in, take a seat. Almost everywhere that uses acceleration gates. This is a rough diagram of the layout of Angel Extravaganza Level 4. This diagram is not to scale, by the way. Aside from the warping limitations, however, dead spaces are exactly like normal space. You can fly around at sublight speed, you can manipulate the grids, you can be scanned down, but anyone trying to warp to you gets diverted to the entry point of the dead space. I'm just rehearsing, please take a seat. It's worth noting that missions are scripted to use the exact same layout every single time. So in Angel Extravaganza Level 4, from the warp-in point, you always go west, southeast, west, west, southeast, and then east for the bonus pocket. Dead spaces, I am just rehearsing. Dead spaces have a boundary where the warp interference ends abruptly. I suspect that this boundary is always spherical, but the radius depends upon the type of site that's creating the dead space. Different sites will create different radii of dead spaces. I suspect that this radius is never less than 20,000 kilometers based on personal observations. By creating mid-warp bookmarks while you're in warp to a dead space, you can eventually drop a bookmark just outside the dead space boundary. One thing you could do is set up a bait ship just outside the dead space boundary and a bunch of sniper battleships 200 kilometers inside the dead space, probably hidden by a portable bush. And when somebody warps to the bait ship, the sniper battleships can start shooting at it. Let's see. You know what? Knowing my presentation, I'm probably on time and I'll probably be fine. I'm gonna reset this all the way back to the beginning. I'll be fine. Hello, take a seat. I was just doing my last minute rehearsal. Yep, everything's good. I'm familiar with the podium now. I should be fine.
Very good. Okay, well, that's all I need to hear. Yeah, good luck. Have fun.
Thank you very much. I will.
Very good.
If there's anything you need, you just come call me.
Say again?
If there's anything you need, you just call me.
I will let you know.
I'll be here. My name is Kali.
Say again?
My name is Kali.
Kali. Got it. Thank you. Sorry, I was just doing a last minute rehearsal. I think I'm fine. But we are a little bit early. It's only about 3:54 by my watch, so I'm going to wait another 6 minutes for people to file in. I pull up one of the chronicles, but this screen is actually controlled from the computer up in the control room, so unfortunately not. I do readings very well, but if I haven't actually memorized it, you probably don't want me trying to tell a story. Hello, please, take a seat. You're a little early. I'm just waiting for people to file in. God bless you. Hello, come on in, take a seat. You're just in time for class. All right, 3:58, so 2 more minutes and we'll get started. Partying hard last night? people getting drunk the night before class. Almost feels like a real university. All right, I think it's just about time, so I shall get started. Hello, I am Seamus Donoghue of Eve University. In most of the Fanfest presentations that you've seen this weekend, you've seen the shape of things to come. In this presentation, however, I will be discussing the shape of things that are, namely the importance of understanding geometry and how it applies to EVE Online. We don't have a lot of time, only 50 minutes, and there's a lot of material to cover, so please hold all questions until the end, and let's jump right into it. The first concept we're going to cover is distance, which is not as straightforward a concept as you might initially believe. Suppose you're in a shuttle, and you've got a shuttle 500 meters off to you in one side, and another shuttle 500 meters in the opposite direction. Your overview says they're 500 meters away, their overviews say you're 500 meters away. That part is simple. But their overviews also report that they are 1,028 meters away from each other. 500 plus 500 is not 1,028. What's going on here is that every ship is surrounded by what I call a zero sphere, the sphere at which you are considered to be 0 meters away from that thing for the purposes of the overview distance. So the center-to-center separation is the radius of one ship plus the overview distance plus the radius of the other ship. The ranges on modules go according to the distance. So for example, a 5-kilometer smart bomb as used by a rock covers a much larger volume when used by a Ragnarok. I will be covering smart bombs again later. For some reason I can't figure out, the angular velocity column in the overview seems to base its calculations on the overview reported distance rather than the center-to-center separation. There are cases where the distance and the center-to-center are drastically different, and I don't know for sure which version is used by the turret hit probability calculations. So if you have a bunch of frigates swarming a bombless Titan, for example, it's important to know whether or not the frigates are out-tracking their own guns, despite being at least 8 kilometers from the center of a Titan. Other types of objects also have zero spheres. Stations are notable in this regard, and in the case of stations, the zero sphere is also known as the docking perimeter. If you warp a fleet of ships to a station at 0, the game will arrange the ships randomly in a ball about 2.5 kilometers in radius and drop the center of that ball exactly on the docking perimeter. So generally speaking, half your fleet is going to be within docking range when you drop out of warp. The other half of the fleet is going to be outside the docking perimeter and will have to slow boat closer to the station. I forgot to mention that by my own testing, you need to be within 250 meters of a station in order to dock. It's worth noting that when you warp yourself to a station at 0, you are randomly arranged on a ball 2.5 kilometers in radius, and the center of that ball is dropped exactly on the docking perimeter. Even odds that you're going to be in docking range when you drop out of warp. However, if you have a bookmark, or properly a saved personal location, located inside the zero sphere, inside the docking perimeter, then you can warp your fleet, or just yourself, to that bookmark, and your entire fleet is guaranteed to be within docking range the moment you drop out of warp. Thus, you can't be bumped off of the station just before docking by an interceptor that's waiting for you. This isn't as much of a concern for stargates, since you only need to be within 2,500 meters of a stargate in order to jump, rather than the 250 meters to dock at a station. By the way, don't place your bookmark too close to the arc geometry of a station. Stations have a collision surface that I will discuss in more detail later. But if your bookmark is too close to a station, a ship dropping out of warp on the bookmark might intersect with the collision geometry, bounce off, and go flying. If the pilot happens to be distracted when that happens, they may be outside the docking perimeter by the time they're paying attention to their client again. There is one other aspect of station geometry that I want to cover in this presentation, and that's the geometry around the undock point. So every station has a point where undocking ships spawn in space, and they're given an initial velocity in some sort of direction, slightly randomized around an undock vector, but not by too much. So this is a Caldari administrative station. The ship brackets that you see are shuttles that were abandoned almost exactly on the docking perimeter. So this demonstrates the shape of the docking perimeter relative to the arc geometry of the station. And the green arrow is how far an undocking ship has to go from undocking to crossing the docking perimeter. For a ship that just undocked, it's very hard to bump it off of the docking perimeter before it gets a chance to dock back up again, which is 10 seconds for the session change timer. This is a Minmatar trade post. This is an example of a short undock station rather than a long undock station. With a short undock station, the undocking spawn point is very close to the docking perimeter, and a ship that undocks only needs to travel a few kilometers before it's outside the docking perimeter and then can't dock back up again. It's much easier to bump off a ship that's undocking from a short undock station than from a long undock station. If you're playing station games in PvP, you need to know the difference. That being said, you don't have to memorize long and short undock stations for every single station in the universe. You only need to memorize it by type, or be able to eyeball it. The zero sphere for any object generally follows 3 rules. 1, it's a sphere. 2, it's centered on the bracket for the object in question, which in this case is the square in the center that's actually labeled Bruder Tribe Bureau. And 3, the radius of the zero sphere is at least big enough to encompass the entire arc geometry of the object in question. The zero sphere around an acceleration gate is worth special mention, since its zero sphere is not obvious unless you understood the 3 rules that I just mentioned. Spherical, centered on the bracket, and encompasses the entire arc geometry. However, in this case, the bracket for an acceleration gate is on the back end of the gate. So the sphere has to have a radius large enough to encompass the front end of the gate. But at the same time, it's also encompassing all the empty space to the left, the right, above, below, and behind the gate. So again, these ship brackets are shuttles abandoned on the zero sphere of the acceleration gate. The zero sphere for acceleration gates has a radius of about 12.7 kilometers. If you want to align your ship for warp along an acceleration gate, but you don't know how long you're going to hold aligned because you're waiting for a signal from the fleet commander, then it's best to start your alignment run off behind the back end of the gate, or the start of the green arrow at the bottom here. For most but not all dead spaces, including most but not all missions, the warp-in point for the dead space is centered on the bracket for the acceleration gate. If you don't want to get caught up on the collision surface of the acceleration gate by warping to it at 0, you can instead warp to the mission to within 10 kilometers, and that's still going to drop you within the zero sphere of the acceleration gate. For my fellow incursion runners, as you know, the warp-in point for an override transfer array is off to the right side of the gate. Aligning from here, it's not very long before you leave the zero sphere, and not long after that you leave 2,500 meters of the zero sphere and can no longer activate the acceleration gate. So if you're sitting on an OTA and you're waiting for replacement fleet mates to show up, you may as well slow boat off to behind the back end of the gate and give yourself more breathing room for aligning. Earlier I mentioned that stations have collision surfaces. Excuse me. In a December 2010 dev blog, Drakes of Destiny, Part 1, Crowd Control Productions revealed that the Destiny physics engine models the collision surfaces of all objects as being one or more balls. And these balls are positioned to approximate the arc geometry. They're invisible on the client side. The only way you can actually detect the arc geometry is if you're flying at the thing and then your velocity changes. So if you're going to do something like place a cuddle bookmark for warping to a station or something, or if you're going to light a cynos field for a jump freighter or a carrier to dock at a station, then you want the entire, oh, I forgot to mention, jumping to a cynos field, a capital is going to appear 5 kilometers off the cyno. So you want the entire 5-kilometer radius to be entirely within the docking perimeter, while also entirely away from the collision surface. That way, the capital that's jumping in can dock immediately without the risk of instantly bumping the station and then going off flying. If you're trying to light a cynosural field for a jump freighter that's going to then jump through a gate into high security space, the same consideration applies. It needs to be within the zero sphere of the stargate, but also outside the collision surface of the stargate. Geometry is also important to consider with smart bombs for a couple of reasons. First, smart bombs have a limited radius of effect, and second, smart bombs may not be fired too close to wormholes, stargates, acceleration gates, or stations. The definition of too close varies by the situation. Under absolutely no circumstances will the game allow you to fire a smart bomb if a wormhole, stargate, acceleration gate, or station would get caught within the area of effect. Additionally, the game will not let you fire a smart bomb within 6 kilometers of a wormhole or 5 kilometers of a stargate, acceleration gate, or station, even if the radius of effect of the smart bomb is smaller than that. So it takes at least a Tech 1 battleship smart bomb to graze the surface of a stargate, acceleration gate, or station, and it takes at least a Tech 2 battleship smart bomb to graze the surface of a wormhole. Of course, these rules also preclude smart bombs from being fired at zero on or inside these objects. So if a smart bomb user wants to smack you near such an object, then he or she has to decide on which side of the object to smack you. So if you want to kill a Covops frigate that's trying to escape through a wormhole, wormholes are kind of small. It's not too difficult to surround a wormhole with several smart bombing battleships. Surrounding a Stargate Creel Air with smart bombing battleships is slightly trickier since it's a slightly bigger object. So you would probably want to make some sort of assumption about where your victim is coming from, such as, for example, it's coming from Stargate Moroidum. This is why Rancer is dangerous. This is why a lot of frigates die in Rancer. This is a good situation to have a recon, tactical, or far bounce bookmark, because you can warp your frigate to that bookmark and then warp to the station at zero, completely avoiding the smart bombing battleship that's waiting there to kill you. Of course, something like a Covops strategic cruiser can tank a full volley of smart bombs, shrug it off, and keep going, so it depends on what you're flying. Smart bombing someone emerging from a wormhole is the same situation as smart bombing somebody trying to escape through it, since emergence and activation distances are the same. Trying to smart bomb somebody who's emerging from a Stargate, on the other hand, is much more difficult because somebody emerging from a Stargate appears 12 to 14 kilometers off the gate in a random direction. So this is not typically done even for small-ish gates. For huge gates, smart bombing somebody who's trying to emerge from them is out of the question. Next, grids. I'll try not to spend too much time here. GridFoo, a practical manual, contains a more complete treatment, but some details may be out of date. I'll try to go over the basic concepts very quickly. What players call a grid is a volume of space where the game believes that uncloaked objects should be able to see each other on the overview. If two players are not on the same grid, they cannot see each other on overview. Grids, however, have boundaries, and they can be crossed in either direction. Grids can expand themselves as needed, but not for a single object herring off by itself into the wild black yonder. To extend the grid, you would have to jettison containers at regular intervals, or have two or more objects traveling together in the same direction. Though in this latter case, the grid can undergo a strange form of mitosis, where the game believes that these two volumes are part of the same grid, but the volume in between is not. So here, this executionist trying to chase these two Atrons is no longer on the same grid. The Atrons have disappeared from the overview. The station is still on the overview, of course. That's a celestial object. Anybody can see a station. Grids have a default size. What I have noticed from many personal observations flying around in low security on a Covops frigate is that the default grid around a Stargate is a cube aligned with the coordinate axes of the solar system, 700 kilometers on edge and centered on the Stargate. I suspect from this that grids are not spherical, but I have not extensively tested all grids. If you warp to the middle of nowhere, then the game will create a new grid just for you, and it will have a default size. As mentioned previously, the grid can be expanded. However, two pre-existing grids cannot merge or overlap, so it is possible to expand one grid at the cost of contracting an adjacent grid. There is a limit as to how far you can push this. I don't know exactly what that limit is, but there will be a point where you cannot push the grid wall any further. Grid walls have interesting effects on combat. The game assumes that if you are not on the same grid, then you are out of range of any combat effects taking place on the other grid. So you can do something, you can, for example, break target locks and warp scrambles by crossing a grid wall. Be forewarned, I do not know CCP's policy on using grid foo to break combat effects at ranges where they would normally operate. If you get banned for exploits, that is on your head. That being said, it's useful to understand the game mechanics so that you know when grid foo is being pulled on you. One time I was in null security in my Covops frigate, and I was moving away from the gate to try and set up a reconnaissance bookmark for the gate. This is my first time traveling through that gate. It didn't have any bookmarks. There were bubbles on grid with the gate, and at about 120 kilometers from the gate, the bubbles disappeared from overview, indicating that I had crossed a grid wall. This should not have happened at 120 kilometers off the gate. It should have happened at least 350 to 600 kilometers, depending on the angle I was flying at, not 120. There were other players in local with me, so I concluded that there had to have been a couple of cloaked players maintaining a separate grid next to the Stargate. Next, warp interdiction bubbles. If you are inside a warp interdiction bubble, you cannot go to warp until you leave the bubble or until the bubble shuts down. Simple, not complicated. If you're trying to warp to someplace on a grid that has bubbles on it, then the game will check for any bubbles in or beyond your flight path on the destination grid. If you're coming back to EVE Online from a long absence, then yes, this is a change. Bubbles no longer interfere with all warps within 85 kilometers of their center. They no longer ignore all warps beyond 85 kilometers of their center. Easier shown than said. So, this bubble will divert your warp. It's in your way and on the destination grid. This bubble will divert your warp. It's in your way and on the destination grid. This bubble will also divert your warp. It is beyond your way and on the destination grid. This bubble will not divert your warp. It is not on the destination grid. It's worth noting that any objects on the Stargate side of the grid wall would not be interdicted by this bubble. This bubble will not divert your warp. It is not on the destination grid. It is not on your starting grid. Forget about diverting your warp. This bubble will prevent you from going into warp in that direction. It's on your starting grid. You have to go around. This bubble will not divert your warp. It is not on the same line. If you have a bookmark and the bubble happens to be in line with the bookmark, then warping to the bookmark will divert your warp. Having a bookmark doesn't help if the bubble happens to be in line with the bookmark and the gate in question. Here, the bookmark is well placed because it just so happens to dodge the bubble that's placed on the grid. The bubble is not on either of these two lines. One time while I was flying in null security, I emerged from a Stargate and an interdictor tried to drop a bubble in front of me to prevent me from going to warp. Thankfully, I was near the edge of the bubble in question, so I just simply aligned to a moon away from the interdictor, and when I left the bubble, I warped to the moon, and then from there warped to my reconnaissance bookmark on the next gate. Yes, I know. Moons can have hostile starbases on them. A lot of moons don't, and the fastest starbase module takes about 7 seconds to lock a Covops frigate. So if you're something fast, like an interceptor, a Covops frigate, any other sort of frigate, then you can warp in and then warp right back out again, and you'll be fine. It depends on what you're flying, though. If you're a big fat battleship, you're probably going to take a few pot shots. Gates can be surrounded by a cage of bubbles. A bubble cage, if you will. Remember that each bubble is spherical, but a collection of spheres is not itself a sphere. So a bubble cage will have nooks that you can try to warp into and then proceed at sublight speed from there to minimize the amount of sublight distance you have to cover to get to the gate. Oh, it's also worth noting that the radius of effect of the bubbles will not decloak your ship. However, if you get within 2 kilometers of whatever is generating the bubble, then that will decloak your ship. 2 kilometers of the center, or 2 kilometers of whatever that thing is at the center. Next up, dead spaces. A dead space is a volume of space where 1, any attempt to warp to a point in the dead space from outside redirects you to the entry point of the dead space, and 2, you cannot warp from one point to another in the same dead space. You cannot warp there because natural phenomena are disrupting the warp. Dead spaces are used all the time in missions and dead space complexes, anywhere where an acceleration gate, almost anywhere where an acceleration gate is used. The level 4 mission, Dread Pirate Scarlet, is a notable exception. That's a mission that uses acceleration gates, but is not governed by a dead space, so you can warp around freely within that mission. Aside from the warping limitations, however, dead spaces are exactly like the rest of normal space. You can fly around at sublight speed, you can manipulate the grids, you can be scanned down, you can use micro-warp drives. If you're coming back to EVE Online from a long absence, then yes, this is a change. You can now micro-warp drive in a dead space. Right. However, if you get scanned down, anybody trying to warp to you gets diverted to the entry point of the dead space. It's worth noting that missions are scripted to use the exact same layout every single time. So in Angel Extravaganza level 4, when you warp into the mission, from the warp-in point, you always go west, southeast, west-west, southeast, and then east for the final bonus pocket, where north is the top edge of the solar system panel in your F11 map browser. Hit F11, opens your map browser, the bottom panel is the solar system, top edge is north, bottom edge is south. Dead spaces have a boundary where the warp interference ends abruptly. I suspect that this boundary is always spherical. But the radius depends upon the type of site that's generating the dead space. Different dead space complexes, different missions will call different radii for the dead space that they're going to create. But I suspect that this radius is never less than 20,000 kilometers based on my personal observations. By creating mid-warp bookmarks while in warp to a dead space, and then creating more mid-warp bookmarks in between those, you can eventually create a bookmark that is just outside a dead space boundary. So one thing you could do is set up a bait ship just outside a dead space and have a fleet of sniper battleships waiting 200 kilometers inside the dead space, probably hidden by a portable bush. When somebody warps to the bait ship, the sniper battleships can pick off that target from long range. If whoever tried to take the bait tries to close on the sniper battleships, then they have to do so at sublight speed. Interceptors can get on your sniper battleships pretty quickly, but any heavy hitters are going to need either time or range to deal with the distance. EVE may be real, but they are not warping to their interceptors at 0 here. Nota bene, I am a generalist instructor, not a PvP instructor. Any PvP tactics that I suggest should probably be vetted by an experienced PvPer. Caveat emptor. Another use for this type of bookmark is as a place to run and hide if you are trying to run away from a fleet that you cannot defeat. So you can warp your fleet to this bookmark and then have everybody micro-warp drive or afterburn across the dead space boundary, and hopefully by the time they get combat probed, they're already inside the dead space, and any attempt to warp to them will redirect a pursuer's warp to the entry point of the dead space, 20,000 or more kilometers away. Even slicker, warping to a bookmark outside a dead space is not diverted. Warping to a bookmark to within 100 kilometers if the bookmark is outside the dead space, is also not diverted, even if the result drops you inside the dead space. So you could warp your fleet to within 100 kilometers of this bookmark, and you'll drop safely inside the dead space boundary. And again, anybody trying to chase you there is going to get diverted to the entry point of the dead space. If they want to catch you from there, they either have to slow boat the 20,000 or more kilometers, which might take an hour or two, or they have to replicate your bookmark and then warp to that bookmark. If I had time, I could probably go on quite a bit longer on the various subjects of how geometry applies to EVE Online. Unfortunately, I only have 50 minutes, and I'm certain that you have questions. Before I take questions, however, and oh boy, the list on the left is badly formatted. Before I take questions, however, I want to thank the individuals on the left for assisting me in the creation of some of the visual aids used in this presentation, and for the individuals on the right for arranging the details on CCP's side to help make this Fanfest session happen. Particular thanks goes to David Reed, CCP Pokathulu, who was kind enough to give the green light to make this session happen, and to my friend Rick Reynolds, ex-CCP Zinfandel, who helped put me in contact with these fine people at Crowd Control Productions. Finally, my general thanks to the people and organizations of Crowd Control Productions for making such a deep and complex game, and to EVE University for providing the community and mission that it is my honor and privilege to be a part of. Thank you. I will now take questions. All right, I saw the gentleman in the center here.
What's the best way, in your opinion, to actually make one of those dead space bookmarks?
It's a little bit tricky. You warp from anywhere, you warp to the dead space first. While you're in warp to the dead space, when you're about, say, 100,000 kilometers out from your warp destination, you create a bookmark. I'm assuming you know how to create a mid-warp.
Yes.
So you create that first bookmark first. Once you drop out of warp, you're going to warp back to that mid-warp. If it gives you the natural phenomena error that you created it too close, and you'll have to start from scratch, try again, and try to create a bookmark at a greater distance out. But once you have that initial bookmark, you warp back to it, and again, while you're in mid-warp, create another bookmark. Remember that as you're near the end of your warp, your ship takes more time to drop out of warp than it does to ramp up into warp, as per the dev log for warp speed changes. So you can, by trial and error, keep warping to this bookmark to try and create more bookmarks. When you get a closer bookmark that works, go back into the dead space, warp to this new bookmark again. If you get a closer point, then that's your new working point, back up into the dead space again, warp to the bookmark. Eventually you'll get a point that seems to be within a few hundred kilometers, and then you can slow boat on micro warp drive from there to experiment. Next, you.
Just want to comment, I thought the bubble mechanics discussion was good, and I think it's important to point out that the server determines where you will exit warp when you enter warp. So if you go and enter warp towards a bubble that's 90K away, and someone takes down the bubble during that time, you will still land as if the bubble was still there. By the same token, if you're already in warp, you've already initiated warp, even if you're not into warp, you're not in your warp tunnel yet, and someone opens a bubble at your exit location, that will not interfere with you because your exit location has already been determined when you initiate.
Right. Exactly correct. I didn't have time to cover that in this presentation, but that is exactly correct. For those of you who did not catch that, what he's saying is that the calculation to determine whether or not a bubble will interfere with your warp is determined at the time that you enter warp, not the time that you leave warp. You. And please make sure you raise your hands high, because some of you, I'm not sure if you're raising your hand or not. Go ahead.
Is it when you press the warp button or when you actually start warping?
It's when you actually initiate warp. So you can be aligning, and until you actually, when you click warp, that's when it asks you. But if you align and then click warp, it's going to be when you actually click warp.
All right, so according to him, at the time that you click the warp button. Next question, I don't see any hands. There.
Is there a method of creating a dead space pocket that will stay there even after the
Not that players can create, at least not currently. Who knows what CCP holds in the future. However, there are certain static dead space complexes that exist all the time. I believe there's one that exists somewhere in, I believe it's the Ani constellation. That's the constellation that Nakugard is in. Nakugard is one jump out from Heck in Minmatar space.
Can they exist in a soft space?
Dead spaces, persistent dead spaces that
Yeah, stay there forever.
I suppose it's possible, but the only such examples would have to have been created by Crowd Control Productions. I haven't surveyed null security space in this regard. Theoretically, it is possible. You.
In the past, I've seen wormholes where people put between two locations a bubble in the middle and people interacting with the world.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I couldn't catch that. Repeat.
I said that before I've seen in wormholes bubbles put in the middle between two locations and it was interacting in the world. And you say that now it's not in the grid of star and no, it doesn't work.
I'll have to do more. I would need more information to do more testing. I suppose it's possible that I might be wrong. Crowd Control Productions has changed the mechanics at least twice. Once upon a time, mid-warp bubbles did pull you out of warp. I suppose it might be at the points where where your position is discretized while you're in warp. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's probably because they stretch the grid out real bad. Some wormholes have been known to stretch the grid to ridiculous lengths to do that. So they'll stretch it to the point where you think you're warping between two grids and you're actually still on the same grid.
Yes, that is true. That would make sense based on what I know. Again, the grid can undergo a strange form of mitosis where these two separate volumes are considered to be part of the same grid. You.
I'm just curious whether or not you can still use corpses in order to implement grid fix.
You should be able to theoretically. Any object at all will maintain a grid or extend a grid, so corpses count. By the way, for those of you who are not aware, corpses usually don't show up on overview because the default overview isn't set up to show them, but they'll still decloak you within 2 kilometers. And I don't think they have a visible bracket.
I thought there was a dev blog recently that changed that, where where corpses no longer decloak.
I do not know. They will at least maintain a grid shape, but I don't know if corpses still decloak. You'd have to point me to the dev blog. I may have missed it. You in the back?
If your ball is fast enough, can you burn the bones for a mistake of propaganda without the key?
Yes, you can. You would have to. I don't know the exact geometry of the layout of Angel Extravaganza Level 4. Just the general notion that the grids are separated by. You have to go from grid to grid according to the acceleration gates normally, and that the whole thing is surrounded by a dead space boundary. But I haven't taken the time to measure it out exactly, so I don't know the optimal way to do that. But in theory, yes, you can do that.
Usually 10K kilometers between.
In most cases, it is 10,000 kilometers. With Angel Extravaganza Level 4, I wrote down the numbers, but then I forgot to bring them with me to Iceland. But some of the separations in Angel Extravaganza Level 4 are much more than 10,000 kilometers. But the layout is approximately as I drew it on the screen. Hold on, let me see if there were anybody who hasn't asked a question yet. And please make sure to raise your hand high and wave it. I've got the lights in my face. You.
I just wanted to ask about this dead space bookmarks. Will they persist at big downtimes? For example, when I accept a mission and then create a bookmark where the dead space edge is, will it work after its downtime as soon as the mission has been completed?
If the mission has not been completed, I think the game will recreate the mission in the exact same spot after downtime. So that I would have to test. You may have noticed that I'll explicitly state, I have tested this, or I'm supposing here based on other things that I've seen, and this is that latter case. As long as the mission is recreating the dead space in the same spot, then yes, it should work after downtime, as long as the mission has been completed.
I think that's sufficient to do that. They recreate exactly the same spot every time.
Okay, so this gentleman says that the missions recreate in the same spot after downtime. So there's your answer. You.
I'm just curious, going back to the bombing battleships on a gate scenario, I noticed that in the wormhole situation, with regards to the concentric circles,
Mm-hmm.
that there was 4 there, but I'm wondering how a wormhole has geometry within space. Is it a circular?
It's a sphere.
Okay, so I guess my next question is, would it be possible for only for smarty battleships in order to be able to cover a hole? Because
No, not for. You have to keep in mind, I'm limited to drawing flat diagrams here. But with geometry in EVE Online, it's 3-dimensional. So where I draw 4, it's actually 6.
Okay, so I guess that answers my follow-on question. Whereas if you were entering or exiting a hole, you could potentially be anywhere surrounding around that outside the hole. There's not a singular entry point
You could be, yeah, you can be anywhere in that shell.
in the sphere. Okay.
Yeah. Within the dotted line. Yeah.
Sorry, I've just got another question with regards to people who have used like a clock face in order to create tacticals around gates and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering whether or not you might have some kind of strategy in order to implement circular bookmarks around gates, but in a spherical fashion. So, north, south, east, and west, but then also outwards, and then from there at differing angles and stuff.
It varies by personal style. However, I'm given to understand that rather than going north, south, east, and west for the laterals, it's clock positions relative to the sun, because the sun is in a very easy reference. Any other questions? And please make sure to wave your hand because I've got the lights in my face. You.
The spawn radius for gates, do you have a list of the different radii
For different stargates?
right, I mean, obviously not all of the game, but for example, system to system within a constellation is some size, constellation to constellation is another size, and then region to region is a third size.
All right.
Do you have this?
Not on me. However, there is a website called Games, and I'm going to botch the pronunciation here, games.trucker.dk. You've probably heard of it. You can look up information on the stargates, and there will be radius information in there. Minmatar constellation gates should come out to be about 12-point-something kilometers. I think the largest gates might be about 20 kilometers in radius, I think. I'm pulling numbers from memory here. But you'll find all of the relevant zero-sphere radii for everything on games.trucker.dk. Yes?
On very rare occasions, I drop out of work when walking to a gate. I'll check the jumping distance. Why is that?
You're slightly outside jumping distance?
On very rare occasions.
Were you flying in a capsule at the time?
No, a freighter.
A freighter, and you're slightly outside jumping range.
Have you set kick at range? You need to revert it back to default if you're jumping.
No, warping towards, so keep at range.
Yeah, if you can right-click the warp button and change your default warp to range.
No, on rare occasions, just once in a while.
Yeah, I can't explain that, unfortunately. I haven't observed that myself, so I don't know what that is. Hold on, let me see if, did anybody else have a question? I'll get to you in a... Remember to wave your hand a lot because I've got the lights in my face and it's hard for me to see raised hands. All right, nobody else. You.
Sorry again. No, I'm just remembering how you were talking about long and short undock distances on certain stations. I'm wondering whether or not you might have compiled a list of all the different stations and whether or not they were short or long and their distance just for fun thing.
I did not prepare that list in time for Iceland. I did prepare such a list once. Part of it is data from the EVE from the static data dump. There's a table that for the various different station types, it should give the radius of the station and the coordinates of the undock point relative to the center of the station, and the undock movement vector from that undock point. And then you can plug those into a spreadsheet, do the appropriate math, and make a table. You in the back?
I just want you to say all Caldari layout outposts on kickout station. It's terrible.
All Caldari what?
Layout outposts.
All Caldari player-owned outposts are kickout stations, as in short undocks.
You can't read off immediately after.
Good to know, thank you. Somebody else had a comment?
Kick-out stations are kind of the term for zero or negative distance, so you're already outside the sphere as soon as you undock.
Gotcha, okay, so really short undocked stations.
Or negative, literally.
Or negative.
You're outside the docking sphere as soon as you.
Right, so a kickout station is worse than a short undock station because you're committed to undocking the moment you do it. All right. Any other questions? Remember to wave your hand. Again, I've got the lights in my face, so I am having a hard time seeing hands being raised. Yes?
There is a vector when you undock, and it has a bit of spread from direction.
It has a bit of spread, yes.
Could it be that for some stations the spread is bigger than for others?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I would need a lot of people volunteering to help me with tests either on tranquility or singularity to figure that out.
I thought of a remark because I tried once to set bookmark in the direction more or less of the undock for a Galenda station, and it just couldn't.
Yeah, I suspect that the angular tolerance for going to warp is slightly smaller than the undock spread, so there are risks that even for a proper instant undock bookmark, you undock at way too wide an angle. Yes?
I'm pretty sure that the angle is larger for cheetah and a few other, maybe a few other breakouts because there was a dust bug about it. So the ships wouldn't collide.
That's interesting. So if that's true, then CCP can change the undock spread by particular station. I wonder if that's in the static data dump. Somebody will have to go look and then help us add it to the university wiki. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any other hands. So thank you for coming to class. And on behalf of Eve University, welcome to Iceland.